On beginning United States research. And Chris is a longtime former Family Search employee and has worked as a Temple Family History consultant at the Granite Family History Center. He's been practically the whole landscape of family history research and very knowledgeable and very accommodating and a kind person, I might add. So we will have a Q&A at the end. So after Chris's presentation, we'll be muted now, but you can unmute and ask questions of Chris at the end of the presentation. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Do we usually have an opening prayer? Or?
No, we are skipping prayers in this go round.
Okay. Can you give me an idea about how many we have present?
Yeah, we have, hang on a minute, I had it here for a second.
8.
Okay, where did everybody?
I see 8.
I think that sounds right, yeah.
8 is great. Okay, well, let's just dive in then. Welcome to Who's Here. And so this, as was mentioned, is going to be kind of a beginning class on U.S. research. As was mentioned, I worked for Family Search for the Family History Department and Family Search for 38 years, and I retired about 4 years ago. So you can't blame me for everything they've done in the last 4 years, nor can I take credit for the good things they've done in the last 4 years. I wanted to find a good map of the United States to kind of start, and I was looking at David Rumsey has a great online historic map collection. And this is a map of the railroads in 1886. And it's germane to our discussion because while some families remain in place for decades, they farm the same land, raise their family in the same neighborhood. But when it does come time to move, they typically follow the roads, the rails, the waterways, or sometimes along the seacoast, they use ships. And it's interesting to note that the distance from 2 ports is really only 2 gangplanks. And so you want to keep that in mind as you're doing your research. So our approach tonight is we're going to talk about some research strategies and some tips. I'm going to cover some various record types and what information they contain. We'll talk about a little bit of history and migration, about where you can find vital records coverage dates, and sources for additional information. So let's start with some beginning strategy and tips. So hopefully most of you know and have a plan that you work from what you know towards the unknown. So as you're researching your ancestors, you're moving backwards in time. Or if you're doing descendancy research from one of your ancestors, then you're moving forward in time. It's helpful to find out what research has already been done. And you want to consider one family at a time. Don't just do one individual, but consider the whole family. Determine where they lived, see what records are available, and you can use the record finder, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, to fill in missing information. Hopefully you're all familiar with the fan chart, which is a great way to look at possible places to begin working on an end of line for one of your ancestors. I was helping my wife try to extend one of her end of lines. And it's important that you actually make sure that the generation before is well documented and well understood so that you've got solid facts as you try to move backwards. Because a lot of end of lines happen because there's missing information or incorrect information. Coming the other direction, to do descendancy research, you can look at the descendancy chart And here's an example of Joshua Taylor Cummings. And he's a descendant of my Oliver Cummings. And I can look at him and I can look at his children and grandchildren and see if I can find some additional research that can be done. This is often called cousin research, because you might be their third cousin 6 times removed or whatever. You want to choose an ancestor that was born about 1800 and work forward from that point. The reason that it's suggested to pick someone about the 1800s, especially in the United States, is because the first census that lists every member of the household is in 1850. So if you pick someone that was born about 1810, and assuming that they lived, they would be about 40 years old in the 1850 census. And by that time, they could be married and they might have children. So those are some strategies. You want to look at the whole family. So many records contain relationship information, and that relationship information is critical to making sure that you're dealing with the same family. Marriage records not only list the bride and groom, but they frequently list the bride and groom's parents. And occasionally, if one spouse has been previously married, they might list the former spouse. Birth records usually list the parents' names. Death records may list the spouse or parents. And as you're familiar with obituaries, you can find parents, siblings, children, grandchildren. Their obituaries can be a great source of information. I had real success with an obituary I found for one of my ancestors. It gave the husband's names and the individual children's names, and I was able to get quite a bit of information about one of my ancestors from one obituary. Each new record you add, each new source builds a more complete picture of the family. You want to evaluate each new piece of information. You want to make sure you're looking at names, dates, places, and relationships, and that they're consistent with other information you found. Although you should expect spelling variations, and it's not uncommon to find mistranscriptions. Ages will vary from one census decade to the next, and not always just by the 10 years, because part of that is true because the censuses were taken at different times of the year. Some were April, some were July, some were at other times. When you find discrepancies, to help you resolve that discrepancy, you want to consider what's the primary piece of information that was documented for this record. And so for a death record, the birth information isn't the primary information. So if there's a discrepancy that's explainable, you would go with already known information about the birth. How close to the time of the event was the record created? The closer to the time of the event, the more accurate or more reliable the record is. Was it an official record? Official records are typically more reliable than personal records. And is there a reason for the difference? Another thing to consider as you're evaluating information is how close is this place to other events that you're already aware of for the family. As I was looking at, again, one of my family line, I noticed that the children were having children, frequently every couple of years, but the locations were bouncing back and forth almost 1,000 miles. And I'm going, that doesn't make sense. And it didn't, because in fact, there were 2 families with similar names that had been blended, and I had to unsort, unmerge, and do some cleanup. So watch where the place is. I frequently will use Google Maps and go and look at and put in the two place names and see how far apart they are. And again, if one of the person that I was dealing with in the obituary, he was helping build the Erie Canal. So that fact that they were moving along the Erie Canal made sense, and they were moving. But otherwise, was the travel reasonable for the time period? Some more suggestions. Obviously, you want to follow the hints that are suggested on Family Search. Most of them seem to be accurate. Now, if it's not, then don't accept it. Also, Ancestry has their little shaky leaves, and those are great hints to follow. You'll want to attach the sources that you find, and the source linker can help you do that. It's helpful to others, and you'll find that you refer back to it yourself. You want to attach the source to everyone that's mentioned, if possible. Again, it helps build stronger ties in that family. And it's pretty easy once you've got the source and you got the source linker up, you can kind of just, sometimes they automatically try to match up the people that if there are relationships known in the source. Otherwise, you can drag and drop and then be able to connect them. You do want to choose the standardized place name because that's used to help find more hints, and an estimated date if you don't have an exact date, because you can update it as you get more accurate information. I always like to track the family across all the census years that are available because I get the most complete picture. Here's an example of a little project I was working on. I was comparing census records, in this case, the 1850 census for Dunstable, Massachusetts, with land ownership map record, a map that I found for the same town in Dunstable. On the bottom of the page, you see Josiah T. Cummings. Well, in the map, it's kind of, the arrow points to where he was living. It's J. Cummins. And the land ownership map was from 1856. So the census and the map were approximately the same time frame, and they're in the same place. And you can actually walk the enumerator's route as you look at the census records. Family Search has a timeline view. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but it's, if you've got details and ordinances, timeline is along that line. And it shows the events in a person's life. It puts a push pin on the map where they occurred, and the route connecting the push pins reflects the chronology of the events. Each of those push pins represents a possible place to be able to find more records about the family. It's helpful to know what records are available at the town, the county, and even the state level. So I went to the Family History Library Catalog, which is highlighted in green. I did search, catalog's in green, and then I typed in the place name. Now the catalog likes to use jurisdictions from high to low. So it's United States, Massachusetts, Middlesex, and Dunstable. And you see that there's actually in Massachusetts, now the federal censuses aren't listed down to the town level, but there is a state census in 1855, a state census in 1865. So sometimes states did their own statewide census on the half decade. Talks about centennial celebrations, directories, genealogy. There are 8 histories, there's 1 town record, and 6 vital records for Dunstable. And of course, there's going to be more records at the county level. Here's a list of different types of records, and this came from the Family Search Wiki or the Research Wiki. I'll let you glance through those. I turned the more commonly used records and made them bold. So census, cemeteries, church records, land and property, newspapers, town records. But there's other records like of vital records, of course, voter records. You'll find uses. Sometimes you look to these other records when you're stuck, and you learn how to use them because you're stuck. So here's samples of 3 of those record types: census, death records, and actually births and marriages have similar, at this time period had similar data elements. And then here's a Find a Grave cemetery record. I've really grown to love Find a Grave. Billion Graves is great, but I've been doing work back in Massachusetts, and Find a Grave has lots of photos of headstones, and frequently they have additional information in the memorial. So I'm going to show you how these 3 records are actually have a relationship. About the middle of the census, and it's super hard to read, there's a William W. Cummings. We're going to find him that's the Sergeant William Wallace Cummings in the cemetery record, and we're also going to look at his death record. Oh, I just want to give you an example of some newspaper records. This was fun as I was preparing for this lesson. I found that looked like the front page of the Nashua, New Hampshire Telegraph had an announcement about the Cummings family reunion. Now, it's important to note that Nashua is just over the state border from Dunstable. There's a picture of Willis Cummings, who is the vice president of the organization. And with OCR technology now, that's optical character recognition, these newspapers can become somewhat searchable. My favorite part of this page is in the lower right-hand corner, where there's the picture of the buggy, and this is for sale by the Cummings brothers. That's particularly useful because my dad sold cars, so it must run in the blood. Actually, my son was involved too. Census records. Census records are fabulous national indexes. Censuses were taken every decade between 1790 and 1940. Now, obviously, more recent ones have been taken, but they're not available for 72 years. And unfortunately, the 1890 census, almost all of it was burned in a fire. Censuses help you locate your family, which gives you keys to other records. They show households in context. One census decade may have a newlywed couple, and the next decade may have family starting, and then teenage kids, and then getting married, and then those kids are starting their own families. Typically they provide names, ages, sometimes relationships, birthplaces, occupations, and more. They might provide indications of wealth and other things that are useful in making sure that you're dealing with the same family. I've watched occupations as I've gone through the census decades, and kind of found it interesting to watch the progression of one ancestor from a clerk to a manager to president of the company. That was kind of fun to see the progression. Now, early census, and this is an example from the 1850, didn't list relationships. So we're going to look in a little bit of detail in this 1850 census. The top of the page, you want to understand the information that's there. It's giving you the locality information. In this case, it's Dunstable, which is a town in the county of Middlesex in the state of Massachusetts. It gives the enumeration date for this page, 3rd of August, 1850, and who the enumerator was. And interestingly, it was an Allen Cummings. Now, I point out the enumeration date because occasionally, for various reasons, you may find the same family in a different place on a different date. And it's possible that they moved during the time that they were enumerated in one place and they were enumerated in the second place. So be aware of that. In some of our polygamous Utah families, it's not uncommon to find people in different enumerated more than once. Okay, later census years, relationships were stated explicitly, but from the early census years, they can be implied or sleuthed out as you look at ages and genders and other records. There's almost the order that they're listed is almost always father, mother, children, and then other family relatives and non-relatives. So here's Josiah T. Cummings, the father, Rebecca, the mother, Juliet, a daughter, William W. we're going to look at closer. Then if you look at the age, you've got Olive Woods. So she's not a Cummings, but I think she's Rebecca's sister, and there's a niece and a probable nephew. Okay, we're going to look at a different record type. It mentions Josiah T. Cummings, but he's mentioned in the death record of his son, William W. William died 27th of October, 1861 in Dunstable, and he was 27 years old. So we're going to look at the original document. Whenever you can, you want to look at the original document. When records are indexed, there are columns that aren't extracted, but they give interesting and sometimes critical information to make sure that you're dealing with the same family. And you may read the record differently because it's your family than the person that originally indexed the record. We're grateful for the work that our indexers do and have done, but it's always helpful to look at the original record. So we're going to zoom in on this record, and we're going to follow the red bars all the way across this page. 27th October, William W. Cummings, male, single, 27. Well, 27 is kind of a young age to die, and 1861 was during the Civil War. Well, we learned that the cause of death was he was accidentally shot by a comrade at Poolesville, Maryland. He had resided in Minnesota. He was a sergeant in the 1st Minnesota Regimental Volunteers, but his place of birth was Dunstable. And we have his parents, Josiah T. Cummings and Rebecca Cummings, both of Dunstable. So this is our guy. This is his death record. Now here's where he's buried. Find a Grave shows that he's buried in the Central Cemetery. It's got his same death date and place that he was killed in Poolesville, Maryland. born in Massachusetts, and he was age 27. So those are all consistent. I like his, but here's this inscription that gives more detail. It said he was among the first to respond to the president's call for troops to suppress the Great Rebellion. And he was killed in the faithful discharge of his duties. He died the death which best becomes a man who has his nation's honor at his heart. So that's cool. And it also gives us tips on some other records to consider. He was a sergeant. He died in the Civil War. It gives us a regiment. So Fold 3 is a great source for military records. And they show that he was enlisted in April 29th, 1861 as a private. He was promoted to a sergeant, and he was mustered in, and he died October 27th. So he was in the service for what, 6 months. And it says killed by accidental discharge of guns. So there's consistency in as we build this picture of the family. Fold 3 also has a story, and I'm not going to go through the details, but they were paid regularly. They had flour rations, not just hardtack. And it talks a little bit about the landscape and how they were doing their jobs. So I was curious how far away from Dunstable Poolesville, Maryland was. So I went to Google Maps and found out that if you took a walking path, it would be 454 miles, which would take about 150 hours. That's 2 weeks marching about 12 hours a day, 30 miles a day. So that's a fair little trek. And he didn't enlist in Dunstable. He was up in Minnesota. So it gives us a little bit of flavor. It's also possible, because they're on the sea coast, that they might have taken a steamship or something for part of the passage. I didn't drill into details on that, but I just wanted to get perspective of the places. I mentioned earlier United States Record Finder, and this is part of the wiki on Family Search. What it enables you to do, and this is only part of the table, is if you're missing an age, which is something that's in column 1, the first records you should consider looking at are those that are found in column 2, and they're listed in priority order. And then if you can't find anything in those, then you look in column 3. So age is found in census, in vital records and cemeteries, but also military and taxation records could have them. So Record Finder can be helpful. This was U.S. migration routes, an excellent chart put together by Family Tree Magazine that I found. It talks about to and from locations. So for instance, Utah, California, and Washington, there were 4 prominent migration routes. The Mormon Trail that we're familiar with, the Oregon Trail, California Trail, and the De Anza Trail. So these trails and their paths are helpful. Again, if you know your ancestor started in one place and ended at the end of one of these trails, there's a probable route that they took. And if you look along that route, you may find other information about their family as they migrated. I zoomed in a little bit on the Mormon migration. We're familiar with the fact that about 85,000 pioneers made the 1,400-mile trek between 1847 and 1869, those 22 years. And the normal trail that they took, obviously there were some people tried to find shortcuts or alternate paths along the way, but that was the main trail. When did vital records begin? Well, that depends on your state. And this is a table that I found. I found it through the Family Search Wiki, but it was compiled by Family Tree. And it goes through all of the states, and it lists when it was common for that state to begin keeping birth, marriage, and death records. Just notice that in New York, not all of those began in about 1880. All birth, marriage, and death records. So what does that matter? I was trying to help my wife on an end of line that we were working on together. And her ancestor was from New York. And we were looking at births in the 1804 timeframe and marriages in the 1819 to 1825 timeframe. So it would have saved a lot more time that was wasted looking for records that don't exist, because they didn't start keeping them until the 1880s. It also gives you a quick clue that you'll want to consider alternative types to the vital records, which we trust because of their being official and close to the time of the event. Do county boundaries ever change, and would that matter? The answer is yes. Both of these are Utah. You probably recognize the one from 1931 more than you do from the one in 1861. But these are excellent county boundaries that were compiled by the Newberry Library. They have the Atlas of Historic County Boundaries, and they go through virtually every change. It's documented with legislation, and it shows their changes. Now, why that may be important is you may think that you know where your family was, and they may be in the same place, but the county changed. So just something to be aware of as you're doing the research. Okay, so here's some links. Now, I know that on my tablet or on my computer, I am able to do a screen capture. So if anyone wants to do a screen capture of this, you're certainly welcome to do so. I'll kind of talk you through these links. The FamilySearch.org wiki is where the Wikipedia is. There's a whole page of the Wikipedia that describes United States genealogy. There's the link for the United States Record Finder we talked about. This is the FH guide that was a great service provided by Bob Ives and Bob Taylors, and many others have helped with that. There's a Project 9, which is about United States research. This is a link that I find fascinating. It's news.google.com/newspapers. And you have to remember that it's plural, newspapers. Google has scanned thousands of newspapers. I've used the Deseret News. The Deseret News, they've scanned from like the early 1850s until, I don't even remember how recent they've come, but like the 1980s or 1990s, maybe even more current than that. They've scanned the newspapers, and you can find their OCR'd, and so there's some searchability. You can go find obituaries. You can find, in my era, when you turned one, you had a picture in the newspaper. But that, unfortunately, that episode, that issue was missing. So I didn't get to see my baby picture that way. But I found my brothers. There's articles about our family, my dad, ski races, my mom and dad's wedding announcements. There's just great things that were covered in kind of the society pages. In fact, you learn to recognize, here's what the obituaries look like. Here's what the vital records pages look like. And the images are scanned, so you can just literally turn the pages of the newspaper, zoom in and read them. Here is that Family Tree Maker magazine. That's that migration map PDF that I used. The next link is loc.gov. That's the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has fabulous things. I'm interested in historical maps, and I found that land ownership map from 1856 in Massachusetts by going to the Library of Congress maps, and I put in Middlesex, Massachusetts, and I selected the time frame. There's just fabulous information. This publications.newberry.org Atlas of Historic County Boundaries is where I showed you about those interactive county boundary maps. If you just search on Newberry Library and county boundaries, you'll be able to get into this atlas. If you happen to have somewhat prominent pioneers, you ought to look at the catalog of churchofjesuschrist.org. This is the church history catalog. They have journals, they have autobiographies, sometimes they have photographs. They have manuscript records that aren't published, and some of them have been digitized and you can see them online. There's just great, well, and this isn't just US pioneers. There's church records from our church, records in other countries. So I left plenty of time for your questions, and that's kind of what I have prepared on. I take any of your questions.
Any questions for Chris?